Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and in this video, I'd like to introduce you to Xcode frameworks and how to apply these to both projects and workspaces. Now, this is a follow-up video to one that I already released on Xcode terminology that introduces you to workspaces. So if you haven't watched that video, I recommend that you watch it first. I'll leave a link in the description. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. There is no starter project for this tutorial, but I do encourage you to work along with me, as I believe that when you do that, instead of just watching, you will understand and retain the concepts better. There is very little coding in this tutorial, so you don't have to worry about that. Now we're going to be creating a couple of projects and a framework. So I suggest that you first create a new folder and call it Frameworks Example. Inside that folder, create a new project using the iOS template and an app and call it Test Project 1. And now create a second project, but this time choose Framework instead of App, and call it Test Models. Now this creates a new independent framework project, and the only thing that is there is the header file. I likely should not have used a space in the name because it gets replaced with an underscore. It would have been better to have used the Pascal case convention. It's similar to camel case, except the first word starts with a capital letter as well. Well, you can add all sorts of things to a framework, such as source code, with objects and functions, as well as resources, documentation, unit tests, build settings, etc. For simplicity's sake here, I'm only going to add a source code file, and that will be in the way of a model object that I want to use in my projects as well as others. So I'm going to create a new file here and call it person. Inside that file, I'll create a person struct. And I'm going to add three properties. The first will be a name property as a string. The second will be age, and that's an int. And then the third will be date created, which is a date. Well, you can close that framework project up now and return to your test project. Now, there are a number of different ways to add frameworks to an existing project, but this is the way that I like to do it. I'm going to select the project and the project target. On the General tab, scroll down to Frameworks, Libraries, and Embedded Content section, and then click the plus button. In the selector at the bottom, choose Add Other, Add Files. Locate your framework folder, which is called Test Modules, and open it, but just select the Xcode proj file, and then click on Open. This adds the framework to the project navigator, and you can see that in your code, but it hasn't yet been made available to your project's target. So return to the test project and its target, and then once more scroll down to the Frameworks, Libraries, and Embedded Content section and click on the plus button once more. This time you'll see that there is a Workspace section at the top, and there is a Test Models framework that you can select and add to the target. Well, now that it's been added to our target, we want to try and use it. So I'm going to open Content View, and in order to use the contents of a framework, we first need to import it into that file. And that's our test model. Well, now that it's been imported, let's use it to create a state variable called person that is one of those person objects. I'll create a person whose name is Aiden, age is 31, and the date created is date.now. I get an error though. It says I can't find person in scope. And in Swift, when you try to create a framework, you're building a set of tools that other developers can use in their own projects. By default, everything inside your framework is marked as internal, which means it's only accessible within the framework itself, like having tools locked inside a toolbox. So this means we need to mark the person struct as being publicly accessible. So now I can return to the framework person object and mark that struct as the public accessibility. Well, now I'm able to create that object, but I get the error person initializer is inaccessible due to the internal protection level. Well, in Swift, structs have what are known as member-wise initializers. And this means that the initializer is built in for a struct, and we don't have to create one on our own. And by default, it's internal. So if we want to expose the initializer outside of the framework, we'll need to create one and mark it as being public. So again, returning to the framework, I'm going to let Xcode create the initializer for me, but I'll mark it as being public. So this fixes our initializer, but I want to make a slight change. I want the date created to be set upon creation. So I'm going to go back to the framework and I'm going to remove the parameter from the initializer itself. And I'm going to set it in the body of the function instead, where I'll set the self date created to be date.now. Well, this means I need to go back to where I initialized that person object and remove the date created argument. Well, everything looks good so far, but let's try to use that object and display some of the properties in our view. So I'm going to replace the content of the VStack with a single text view that displays the person.name. Well, now I get an error that name is inaccessible due to internal protection levels. Well, this is the same issue that we had when we couldn't initialize the object. We had to make the initializer public. Well, we only made the initializer function public, and the initializer is able to assign values to the properties because they're internal to the framework. By that I mean the initializer and the properties are in the same module. But in order to make those properties visible to other modules or projects and make them updatable from another module like our project, we have to make each property public as well. When I return to content view, I see that the problem is solved. So let's display the content of our other two properties in the view. For the age, I'll use string interpolation to display age along with the person's age. For the date created, again, I'll use string interpolation to create first a string created on, and then I'll present the person.dateCreated, but I'll use formatted and specify that the date is long and the time is shortened. So far so good. I can read the information just fine and display it, but can I change it? So let's create a button with a label increment age. And I'm going to give it a bordered prominent style. And then for the action, I'm just going to add one to the current age property for that object. Tapping the increment age button does indeed increment the age. The age property is exposed to us because it is public, and this means that I can get and set the values. But this also means I can set new values for the name and the date created properties as well. For example, I can, within the same action, change the date to a date.distantPast each time I click on the button. This is not good. I don't want the users of my framework to be able to modify that property. I want it to be only set upon initialization. They should only be able to read that value. So I'm going to return to my framework, and I'm going to make a change to the access levels of that one property. We want it to be publicly available for getting or reading, but only allow the initializer to set it, i.e., I want to make the private access to this framework only for setting purposes. And we can do that by adding a private set after the public declaration. When you do that now, you can return to your view where the action is, and you'll see that we can't assign to property date created setter is inaccessible. So mission accomplished. So I bet you're wondering at this point, why did I want to go through all of this trouble to create a framework? I'm only working by myself and I don't need to import a framework. I could have created that person struct directly into my project and not worry about the access and private and public and all that stuff. Well, frameworks allow you to create code that can be used in multiple projects. And a little while ago, I created a video on Xcode terminology that introduced you to the concept of Workspace. I'll leave a link in the description. I recommend that you watch that first if you haven't already. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is remove the framework from my test project. So I'll open the test project and I'll click on the target and the General tab. I'll scroll down to the framework section and I'll select that test module's framework and then click the minus button. This removes the framework integration from the project, but not the framework files itself. So in the project navigator now, I'll select the frameworks group and I'll tap the delete key on the keyboard. But do not move to the trash because this will move the folder from your framework examples folder. You just want to remove the reference. Your project will no longer build, of course. Now, if you return to the Finder, you'll see that you still have both the project and the framework folders there inside your framework examples folder. And I want to turn this into a workspace. So I'm going to open Xcode. And from the File menu, I'll choose New Workspace. And I'm going to select the Frameworks Examples folder. And for the name, I'm going to go with the same name, Frameworks Example. Now this creates an empty workspace. Well, as you would have learned in the video that I mentioned, the best way to add projects to a workspace is simply to drag the project's Xcode proj file into the Workspace Navigator. So let's start with the test project. Let's do the same with the test models framework. And as I mentioned in the previous video, the best way to do this to avoid nesting is to drag above any existing project. Once it's in its place, of course, you can drag and move and rearrange them in the list. So the framework now can be added to any project in the workspace. We currently only have one, so let's do that. So if you select the test project now and go to Content View, you'll notice that it's broken because it cannot find the framework. So select the project target and then on the General tab, scroll to the Framework section. And then when you tap on the plus button, you'll see all frameworks that have been added for the workspace. And in fact, there is just one. So I'm going to add it. Now, when you return to Content View, you'll see that our view displays properly. This means that we have a workspace that can have many projects, and those projects can all share any frameworks that have been added as part of the workspace. So let's see if we can figure that one out. So let's add a new project to the workspace. And I'm going to do this right within the workspace instead of how I showed you before in that previous video, where I created a project on its own and then dragged the Xcode proj file into the workspace. This time within the workspace, I'm going to choose New Project. And then I'll make sure that I choose iOS and the app template, not the framework. And I'm going to call it Test Project 2. And I'm going to save this in the Frameworks Examples folder. But this time I'm going to choose to add it to the Frameworks Examples workspace. And this is really important, this part here. Make sure that you also add it to the root group instead of the app group for our test project. Now you'll notice that once it's added, if Content View is selected, it's not displayed. And we learned in the video I referenced on Workspaces and Schemes that you must make sure that you've selected the proper scheme for the app. And we're in Project 2, while that scheme that is being active right now is for Project 1. So if I change the scheme from the scheme selector, it works just fine. But if I wanted to return to Project 1's content view, it wouldn't display. So the solution, as we learned in the other video, is to create a new scheme and make sure that it works for both our project targets. So I'll create a new scheme. And I'm going to make sure it's based on one of my projects, not the framework. And I'll call it All iOS. Next then, I'll edit the scheme. And then on the Build tab, I'll add in the targets for our other iOS app. Well, now that this scheme has been added and it's active, we can easily switch between our project views, and they both display. Well, the framework was added to the workspace. So this means that our new project can embed it. So I'm going to select the second project and its target. And then on the General tab, I'm going to scroll down to the Framework section and tap the plus button. And you'll see that the framework is available to add. So let's do that. Well, now that we've added the framework to this project, we can use it. So in Content View for the second project, let's import test models. Then I'm going to create a new state property here that I'll call person as well, and just create a new person object. I'm going to use different strings for the name and for the age. Then I'm just going to return to the first project and copy the same code in the VStack, and I want to reuse that in this second view. Testing, we see that it works just fine. We added the framework to the workspace, and any project in the workspace can use it. Well, the beauty of having a shared framework is that you can modify the content, and it'll be updated for all projects that have it embedded. Let me show you an example. Let's open the person file in the framework. And I'm going to add a new public property after the name property that's going to be a string called last name. Remember, it has to be public. But since we don't want our first app to break, in the initializer, I have to add the last name parameter as a string, but I'm going to initialize it as an empty string. But in the body, then we can set self.lastName is equal to last name. So what it means is I don't need to add a last name if I don't want to, which I didn't do in that first view. Now we have the option of including either a last name or not. So let's also add a publicly accessible computed property called full name that is a string. And this will return a different string depending on whether or not last name is empty. So we can use a ternary operator and return just name if it is empty, or the name plus a space plus a last name if it isn't. So let's check out our first project. It still works. Now let me go to the second project, and I'm going to add a new property to our person struct after the name that's called last name, and specify a string for the last name for this person. And then I can go to the text view here, and instead of using person.name, I'm going to use person.fullname. And it works as expected. Perfect. Now if I return to the first project now and do the same by displaying the person.fullname instead of just the person.name, I see that our result doesn't change because we had not added a last name. The computed property worked for us. So the further you go into your development career, the more you'll be modularizing your code and using workspaces and frameworks, especially if you're working for teams. So that's it for this video. If you found this tutorial helpful, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. You can subscribe to my channel to get notifications of new videos. And remember, you can always download my YouTube channel listing app for free and get quick access to all of my 300+ videos. The link is in the description.